Hopefully you've had some time to just think a little bit about theory, how maybe it relates to what it is that we want to do here within the industry and discipline of sport management. Well, be remiss if we didn't talk about some of the dominant theories within sociology that have increasingly been applied to understanding from a social scientific point of view sport, recreation, physical activity. Sociology has been institutionalized as a discipline for quite some time. I mean, you can go back, 150 years and really start to get the seeds for sociology being sown. And sociology is different than psychology, which is about the individual, and this is more about groups. It's not philosophy, which is more about the existence of things, whereas in sociology, we're not necessarily debating the existence of something as much as how people interact with the idea of something. Okay, so these are the major theories, kind of historically, that are going to be important. Again, as I've talked about before, these theories can get very complicated. However, we want to talk about some of the pros and cons of each theory, how it might be useful to us as we move forward for understanding the impact that sport can have on a variety of individuals and communities. The first one, if you know, structural functionalism is kind of in a, it's there smaller and it's in parentheses because structural functionalism in its purest sense talks about things from a macro point of view. Okay, it's really looking at society, and it talks about this organic analogy of society being almost like an animal, and each institution, such as marriage and family, business and economics, sport would be one of those major institutions in society, and all these things work together to keep the quote-unquote society alive. So as a result, sport or exercise or that type of industry, recreation and whatnot, are going to be looked at in terms of how they complement other aspects of the system, of the society. So you can learn something like discipline. You learn that in the institution of religion. You learn discipline and values that are important to you growing up in whatever constitutes your family. So family, religion, and sports can all be places where you learn about discipline and values that are important to being, for an example, an American. Okay? Primarily, for those of you that don't know, for what it's worth, lifelong Green Bay Packer fan, very excited, and very proud as a kid growing up in the desert Southwest at times. Never lived in Wisconsin, anything like that. So you'll see a lot of Green Bay Packer pictures. Also, I do own part of the Green Bay Packers. That's kind of my big claim to fame. I've got a couple shares. Let's be honest, doesn't mean anything, but we'll talk about this later when we start getting into the whole idea of identity from symbolic interactionism and what this actually means. So suffice to say, you're going to see a lot of Green Bay Packer pictures as the semester unfolds. Getting back to functionalism or structural functionalism, sport is going to be seen as a positive socializing force. What does that mean? Well, socialization, and we'll talk more about that in subsequent modules. So socialization is all about learning, right? Learning how to be an American, learning how to be a part of a particular culture or a group. All right? Well, what sport does is it provides an opportunity for everyone to learn what it means to be integrated into that community. So as a result, from this point of view, sport contributes to the overall system, society if you will, by showing us the values that are going to be held near and dear here in American culture. Work ethic, cooperation, teamwork. And teamwork goes beyond sports, doesn't it? You can kind of think about this in the world of business. There's business coaching. You talk about being on teams and teamwork, and so sports has sort of provided a model or a blueprint for how to increase efficiency within the business world. Right? And then a lot of that stems from this notion that sport is some sort of positive unifying force. Think about this. All right? We talk about there's no I in team, right? I mean, there's a me, but there's no I in team. Okay, it's about the collectivity being larger than and more important than the individual parts. Right? That's something that we hold as important here, especially within team sports, within American team sports. And it's kind of interesting because America is a very individualistic culture. That's not bad or anything. It's just that means we have to really then learn about this whole idea of positivity and the collectivity, how they link together. And one way, not the only way, but one way that you do that potentially could be through this institution of sport. Also, if sport was bad, if it truly was this thing that was negative, and that athletes getting in trouble and coaches yelling at all that was truly a bad thing, then you probably wouldn't have scenes like this. All right? And we talk a lot about role modeling within the institution of sport. And it's true, and whether people like to admit it or not, because of the high-profile nature of athletes, coaches, franchises, whatever, and this extends all the way down to college sports or even down to scholastic sports, high school sports. Growing up sometime in Texas and seeing that high school football players are role models of the community, or these people are extremely high profile. All right, and so sport is going to be seen as contributing something. It benefits society more than it takes away. As a result, since that's the underlying idea, then what we want to do, using kind of this functionalist, this structural functionalist orientation, sport is a positive thing, then what we'd want to do is grow organized sports, get more people involved into understanding and participating so they can receive these positive messages. We also know through a lot of research, and this kind of is in alignment with a functionalist orientation, is that sport participation can provide opportunities for individuals, not just in terms of moving up, but in terms of networking, providing them skills, self-esteem, those types of things. Another thing that we have to kind of take into consideration is that if sport is this positive thing and we want to make sure that it's reaching out to as many people as possible, then you need to increase the control and the supervision of the individuals within that institution, so that if someone gets in trouble, they are highlighted and they're extricated from that. Okay, and so this control component is because the individuals are not as important as the overall system. Also the coach. The coach is an authority figure. Coaches are providing this access, this entree into teaching these important values. Well, who's teaching a coach how to coach? So, using again this functionalist point of view, you'd have what they call mandated coaching education programs, where coaches are trained, just like teachers are trained to teach, or EMT are trained to do their job, or military are trained to do their job. Coaches should be trained explicitly to do their job, which is to this whole idea of development. And then finally, you want to promote the success, whatever that is, not just athletic success, but also off the field, off the court, off ice success. And hopefully you can see that there are going to be some issues with this. No theory is perfect, and so every time we want to talk about limitations of these things. One, with functionalists, is that two things. One, it's kind of overstating all of these positives that can result from sport, and it sort of overstates the overall positive impact that sport can have on societies and groups and communities. And it also assumes that everything is purely a meritocracy, which means you're going to move up based purely on your merits. Well, when you think about the, opportunity to participate in sport is not just about athletic talent. It's having literally possibly the economic opportunity. For me, lacrosse is one of my favorite sports of all time, but growing up in New Mexico, there wasn't a lot of opportunity to participate in lacrosse. So not everyone has equal access and therefore can benefit equally from every sport. Also, when you start thinking about functionalism, is sort of optimistic because it assumes that everything in society is here for a reason, and if that's the case, then nothing should ever change. Because we are a functioning, efficient society. Well, and sport is constantly changing. The rules of the games are constantly changing. Sports' impact on society is constantly changing. Sports' impact on certain racial, ethnic, or cultural groups is constantly changing. And so a theory that doesn't deal well with change has some limited usage in trying to explain, identify, and understand the impact of sport in a particular culture or society. So there's some negatives about functionalism, and conflict theory is sort of like the bizarro cousin, the yin and the yang, if you will, of functionalism. It was developed basically in opposition to functionalism. Much like functionalism, it's a macro theory. Now, conflict theory is more kind of a paradigm. It's a group of smaller theories that have sort of coalesced into this thing that we call conflict theory. But I'm just going to treat it as sort of one monolithic entity in theory. Okay, we don't need to sort of concern ourselves with the different facets and so on and so forth. So, what is conflict theory? It sees society as basically this system of structures, institutions, if you will, that are held together by economics. Conflict theory, money, power. That's what you need to know. All right? And so sports, as a result, we're going to be looking at this whole idea of money and power. You know, if you want to look at the NCAA and the exploitation of student athletes, copyrights, likenesses, all those different types of things, a conflict theorist point of view would say, that's not really fair. There's something about that system that's inherently not equal. It's not equitable, and these individuals are being exploited. And so what conflict theory wants to do then is to focus on who's in charge, who controls the power, the money, all these different types of things. Just an example of, when you start thinking about how power is distributed within something like the NFL. Roger Goodell works for the owners. The owners, there's 32 franchises. Players get a lot of the pub. They get a lot of the publicity. They get a lot of the accolades. But do they really have all of the power? Do they have most of the power? Do they have any of the power? Kind of a question to ask, and that's kind of where we start when you start thinking about conflict theory. Just take a few minutes to kind of read over these things. Kind of gives us a sense for where power and authority is going to be held within something like the NFL. Well, you can read that at your leisure, but again, the whole idea of if you have a grievance, if you have a problem, if you have questions, there is a distinct protocol within an organization, such as the NFL, that you follow. I mean, we're very used to, as individuals living in this country, or these types of bureaucratically structured organizations and entities, we're used to going up a chain of command. And so as you start thinking about that process of a chain of command, and some of this sounds very, very easy to understand because we're so used to it. Well, there is a bit of, kind of backing out and looking much more at the macro level. There is a bit of class inequality because groups at the bottom, student athletes, for example, don't get me wrong, student athletes do receive some perks, okay? But exploitation is more, it's an economic formula, really, and it looks at things like, are you receiving what you put into it? Student athletes receive a scholarship. There's a lot of prestige and status, and if you want to be Debbie Downer and you can say, well, for example, the cheating scandal and tutoring scandal and grade scandal at University of North Carolina Chapel Hill involving basketball and football players. Okay, they do receive perks, but these athletes are helping to develop an industry that has hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars. And so that technically would be exploitation. And again, these are not my points of view. These are just ideas that stem from a conflict theory orientation. When you use conflict theory and you start looking at it in reference to something like the institution of sport, recreation, and physical activity, it's going to focus on the inequality, right? The Northwestern football players and their attempts to possibly unionize, that type of thing. Understanding about, yes, I'm a professional athlete, NBA, for example, and I'm going to make $2 million next year. But Maybe I'm a key player, and so as a result, my market value, and we talk about this a lot, there's an economic component to things, my market value is actually $8 million. You could make the argument that that individual is being exploited. So from all of this, a conflict point of view would say we need to focus less on the commercial spectator aspects of sport and focus, kind of return back to the play and the game of years gone by. Now, the problem with that is that, one, the cow's already left the barn to some extent. It's hard to just stop midstream and go backwards and say, oh, hey, let's go back to the good old days. Two, were there ever really, quote unquote, good old days? You know, you can look back throughout human history, and as long as you have organized sport, regardless of the time, space, and place, there have been some of these issues. Also, conflict theory is so focused on the money, all right, economics and power that results because of that, that it tends to lose focus on some of the other aspects of life that really do influence how and why people do or do not succeed or participate in sports. Gender, race, ethnicity, age is going to be a very important one. If you're talking about able-bodied, disabled dichotomy, all right, fact remains is that, let's say you've got some money, okay, but you were born with a congenital disorder where you can't walk, but you're living in a rural area. Unless your parents can literally, let's say your dad's a farmer, okay, kind of coming from my background at, you know, rural areas in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, New Mexico, all right, family can't just up and leave regardless of how much money you have and move to a metropolitan area like Kansas City or Oklahoma City or, you know, Albuquerque or something like that so that you can participate in disabled sports, all right. So there are other things other than the money that are going to influence your participation in sports. Also, and I go back to the people that exercise regularly, run those marathons, you're not running, there's a lot of people that are not running 26.2 miles simply because it economically benefits them. There's something about sport that it tugs at emotion. It's born out of irrational emotion, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. All right, people go and tailgate all the time when it's 125 degrees in an asphalt parking lot or when it's minus 10 degrees. They're out there doing it, and that has very, very little to do with money.